All right, welcome to the Defending the Biblical Roots of Christianity YouTube channel. Today we have an interview, and I'm really excited about our guest because we're going to get into an area of the theology of Torahism, or Hebrew roots, as it's more commonly known. We're going to get into an area of that theology we've not really gotten into on this channel before. This area of Hebrew Israelites, or Hebrew Israelism, also known as Black Hebrew Israelite. So this is going to be a very interesting conversation. We also have as our guest sort of the opposite side of the coin as me. This is a guy that's a street apologist, and he's out there talking to folks one-on-one in groups, and has some very interesting stories. But he's also quite brilliant. So I'm excited to welcome you. And as usual, I'm not going to give him a whole lot of background because I love to hear people's stories in their own words. But please welcome from Phoenix, Arizona, Vocab Malone.
Thanks for having me, brother. It's great to make your acquaintance, man.
Yeah, it's good to connect. As we were talking before the show, we've got sort of a mutual connection through Andrew Rappaport, who introduced us a little while back, but took us a while. Now we're having the conversation. That's great.
Sometimes they call me Slow Cab for a reason.
Okay, that works. And I'm also Slowberg, Robert Slowberg.
Okay, well, there you go.
I've actually never been called that, but now it's out there. Good. So I kind of just gave you a brief overview. I'm excited to get into your area of specialty and to chat about this, because there's a lot of overlap in what we do here on this channel. And I feel like my viewers are going to be very interested in the stuff you have to bring today in this area of theology. So give us a little recap. What's your background and the current work you're doing?
By God's grace, I was converted at a pretty young age, and then I was in the city, so I got into hip-hop culture, tried my hand for a long time. It was very important to me coming up in Christian hip-hop and stuff like that, and that really transitioned into street evangelism, which transitioned into street apologetics, and one day I ended up taking it online, and now here we are.
Oh, wow, that was quite the run. Okay, that's very cool. So when you say street apologetics, define what that means for our viewers.
Contextualized apologetics to questions of the city or those influenced by the city.
Okay.
And so that's one way you can look at it. Sometimes people use the term urban apologetics. The title of one of my books is Street Level Apologetics, and there's sort of a play there where it's at the street level, literally, you're on the street, and even if you're on the internet, it's kind of related to that. But
right.
Then also street level in the sense of for every man to understand it, using that parlance as well, street level. So like this book is written where you should be able to pick it up no matter where you're at with this stuff and get most of it. You know what I mean? So I use it that way. But yeah,
very cool. Okay. That's great. So when your specialty, I don't know if you would call it that, your special area of expertise, and we were just talking about this offline, that there's not a whole lot of big names out there who are addressing this. And that's very similar to the work that I'm doing. But it's also super important. You know, I mean, souls are hang in the balance in some cases. And how would you define what you called Hebrew Israelites, Hebrew Israelism?
I go with similar to what you say, Torahism. I do call it Hebrew Israelism. Some secular scholars use the term Black Israelism. I just go with Hebrew Israelism. And the central defining component is this. At the very least, there may be more, but at the very least, folks who are Black Americans are the true genealogical descendants of the ancient Israelites. And that entails certain things. It's theologically, soteriologically, ecclesiastically relevant. Okay. So it has real praxis to it.
Sure. Okay. So we're talking about a sort of racial component to Torahism, where, if I'm hearing you correctly, are you saying that the belief within that theology is that all Americans of African descent are actually part of the tribes, or just some of them?
Well, here's where it gets tricky already, brother.
We're already into it.
In general, the idea is if you came over here, your descendants came over here on a boat, then you're an Israelite. Okay. But as a convenient trump card they keep in their back pocket that there could be tares sown amongst the Israelites. Usually they use that for apostates and things like that. And so it may be like, we thought you were a Semite, but actually you're a Hamite. Because these folks do not believe they descend from Ham. Their big thing is we descend from Shem. They don't even like the term Semitic. They like the term Shemitic.
Okay.
And so there is that element. And then it's a question with each individual Hebrew Israelite, who else do they include? Because I remember I said at least. So some would include a lot of people on the continent of Africa. Others would say no, but they would include a lot of people in the Western Hemisphere.
Okay.
And so it depends what kind of Israelite they are, who they decide to include in their group that always includes them.
Okay. So is this it's not a monolithic movement? There's lots of different belief systems within.
Yeah. There's no Vatican City. There's
Right.
no Pope. And it definitely is something that breeds and lends itself to a DIY situation. And that's why it is surpassing the Nation of Islam as the biggest alternative urban spirituality.
Wow.
Because it's not centralized in Chicago. It's not centralized around Farrakhan. There's a few offshoots of the NOI not a lot of people knew about. This is a different thing. There are what we call camps, what they call camps,
Okay.
all over. Right before we logged on, I was watching some guys in the UK because they were live out on the street, Hebrew Israelites in the UK, saying the same exact things that guys over here would be saying. And so it is a worldwide phenomenon, primarily within, I guess, what we might call Western civilization, but heavy in the US, and then it spreads out here and there. But it is also growing on the continent of Africa, different versions of Hebrew Israelism. So
Okay.
it is an up-and-coming religion. It is not an established religion, although it did come around in the 1890s, so it's been around for a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, that's it. So is it related to British Israelism?
I think it's the mirror image.
Okay.
So, if you study this, the Anglo Israelites, the British Israelites, when they started including America more, that kind of morphed into Anglo Israelism. But that element of thought beats out what we can look at as far as Black Israelism by about a century.
Yeah.
When you study it. And so some of these arguments, man, they are like Anglo Israelites argument, just flipped on their head. For example, British, the term British, right? The Anglo Israelites would say, oh, Brit-ish. That means Britain is the island of the covenant man. You saw where I was going with that, right?
Yeah.
The covenant man, right?
Wow.
And so that was some proof of who they were, right? And they would also say things like Anglo-Saxon. It's actually a corruption of the term Isaac's sons. And so the Anglo-Saxons are Isaac's sons. Well, Hebrew Israelites got the same thing going on. They actually use the same argument in relationship. Now, this is specifically a group called the One Westers. That's not a group. That's a ideology within Hebrew Israelism.
Okay.
And they actually use the British argument. But they say it's evidence that a Israelite aristocracy was in charge of Europe. And so you see it reflected there. And some even go as far as to say that's why it was called the Dark Ages, because it was ruled by dark men. And when I say some, I'm talking about the leader of IUIC, the biggest One West group there is. So this is not a random guy.
Yeah.
It says that's why it was called the Dark Ages, and that's why they were called the Knights, because they were black as night. And I'm not making this up. So this is the kind of wackiness it can get into. But to answer your question, yes, I do believe some of it's a direct ripoff of Anglo Israelism.
Yeah, it was reminding me of that when you were mentioning it. So talk about what did you call it? One West? Is that is that something they call themselves, or is that something you needed to clear?
Yes, it is.
Oh, okay. And what does that refer to?
So it is something they call themselves, but it is something that I popularized, to be frank with you. Now, because when they would use it, they would usually only use it to refer to just a school's location, because the school that is the ideological grandfather of a lot of these modern groups was at One West, 125th Street in Harlem, New York. That's where the One West comes from. Okay. So they would usually use it to refer to the actual place, back at One West. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
And one camp in particular viewed themselves as the ideological descendants, and so they would use that term the most. ISUPK is the name of the group. But I said, how do we describe these kinds of Israelites, the ones who do accept Messiah, they do accept New Testament, they have the 12 tribes chart a lot of times, they have Lashua and Kodash, their own language, they believe in the hard bondage for the other nations, these distinctives that not all Israelites agree with, right? And several ideas kind of went around, and One West or One Westism was the best term by far. And now when you go on newspaper articles, you'll see them using it, but they use it with a ONEWEST, whereas I use the actual one because I like to keep it referring to the actual address, and so that's why I still use the one. This is the subtitle to my book. So One Westism is something a lot of Hebrew Israelites know about, but if they're not informed about the history, they may not actually even know that they're descendants of One West Israel. Like somebody in America who believes in kind of standard evangelicalism, by default, a lot of times, I think could properly be described as Arminian or Wesleyan. Usually, to some extent, about sort of the default position. I'm saying, sort of standard evangelical, like a Billy Graham type, something like that. But they may not know that. They may not know anything about the history of that term. That may, it's similar with these guys. But now a lot more of them know about it because I've been like telling them, "Hey, you're descendant from One West."
No,
how do you know that?
I see.
You got a 12 tribes.
Torahism. Yeah, most of them have no idea they've descended from the Millerites and the Armstrong and all that.
There you go.
So here's something interesting. My wife and I do a prison ministry. So about every 4 to 6 weeks, we fly somewhere and play at some state penitentiary. And we were just in Florida. We play music. So
right on.
And it's awesome.
You spell it the Soulbergs with a U.
That's right. We should, the way my wife sings. She's super soulful. But we were at a prison in Milton, Florida, correctional facility. And hanging out before we went out in the yard to, set up our gear and perform. And we were right off of the chapel, the prison chapel. And I saw this sheet on the wall that listed all the groups that have checked out the chapel for certain times. And I noticed every Friday around 5 p.m., I think it said Hebrew Israelites. So they've got the chapel checked out for an hour every Friday. I assume it's Shabbat or something, the Shabbat dinner. But I asked the chaplain there, how many people attend? And she said, it's probably 7 or 8 right now. And I said, is there any sort of a leader? And she said, no, it's like a group effort, but there's always one guy that kind of knows something and he's sharing it with the others. So we got into a little bit of a conversation, and it's interesting, echoing kind of what you were just saying, how that particular theology is really growing within even like the prison system among African Americans. And actually, even among, they say black and brown. So there's charts out there. You probably know all this, but we'll connect a certain tribe of Israel to a certain black or brown heritage or ancestry. Have you seen those charts?
I'm pointing at one on my wall in front of me.
Yeah. So my question for you about that is,
it's called the 12 Tribes of Israel chart. Yeah.
Is it a standardized chart that kind of everyone agrees to, or is there different versions of it?
There was, and the man who invented it, Ariyah, died Sunday. So Ariyah invented it sometime in the 70s. But what happened is when the groups started splitting out in the early 2000s, all these different groups, some of them made alterations to the chart. And so I can usually tell you what group it is or who they're affiliated with by the chart they use, because there's minor differences. They're usually pretty minor, though. Yeah.
Okay. You don't have one that you could show on screen, do you? I guess maybe I could find a graphic and pull it up.
Maybe if I can, I wonder if I can turn my camera around here. Hold on just a second.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of talk through that. I think that's one of the most interesting aspects. So for our viewers, and this is my opportunity to be corrected if I'm wrong, that's a hint for you, Vocab.
Gotcha.
The understanding is that there's 12 tribes of Israel, and each of those 12 tribes have morphed into or become. Yeah, that's the one I've seen. So you've got the tribe of Dan that equals whatever country, and it looks, I can't really read it from here, but yeah, there was a number of them from Africa, but I also saw some from South America. One I saw.
I'm trying to zoom in. It's not letting me.
That's all right.
Okay, so here we go.
There you go.
So that's a little closer. No, there's nothing with Africa on there, but sometimes at the bottom in the newer tribe charts by IUIC down here, it'll say Isaiah 11, and that will basically say Israelites scattered abroad. So it's sort of the junk drawer of Israelism.
Okay.
But meaning it's a catch-all is what I mean by that. So at the top it says Judah, American blacks, Benjamin, West Indian blacks, Levi, Haitians, Ephraim, Puerto Ricans, Manasseh, Cubans, Simeon, Dominicans, Zebulon. Now it changes into regions here, Guatemala to Panama. And it says Mayans, even though the Mayan Empire didn't even stretch down to Panama, historically speaking. Gad, Native American Indians, Reuben, and even though they are Native American Indians, you just have the Seminoles standing alone in the silo by themselves, even though they should be in Gad, hypothetically. Asher, Colombia to Uruguay. It says Incas there, Issachar, Mexicans, Aztecs, Naphtali, Argentina to Chile.
Wow. Okay.
So that's the IUIC chart right there.
Okay.
That you're looking at. That's
and this is the guy that
them.
just passed away recently? He made
Arya invented this. He says the Lord gave it to him. And sometime in the 70s, he was 82, so he just died Sunday.
Okay.
And no one really knows where the first copy is, what year it came out. No one knows any of that. But nonetheless, they do know that he's the inventor. Let me switch my cameras here.
Sure.
They do know that he's the inventor, but normally it's the Lords or something like that, right? Not just Aryas. They think that's sort of minimizing it. Let me zoom out. I understand that I'm zoomed in now because of what I just did.
Okay.
And
we're going through all the technical trouble.
Yeah, it's a distinctive though. So the One West, the 12 tribes of Israel chart, it's a distinctive to the One West camps. Not all Hebrew Israelites get down with the chart, and in fact, some of them are offended by it because it includes basically non-black people. In fact, black folks are outnumbered on the chart. You know, if you look at the chart, I guess you could say Judah, Benjamin, Levi are properly speaking, right? But everybody else, I mean, right? And, you know, I'm not the DNA expert, but I can tell you one thing. This creates a massive problem when it comes to haplogroups, because you get all these different haplogroups that are supposed to be descended from the same, you know, father, ultimately Isaac. And it's like, bro, come on now, you know. So there are problems.
There are. I'm just really honest trying to self-edit. Because there are a ton of problems. So one of the things I wanted to ask about, though, is if that chart were true, what do they say about people who are actually of Israelite descent, the Jews? Do they
Khazars
chart somewhere?
Oh no, they're Khazars. They're imposters.
Actual Jewish people are imposters? Okay.
Yeah. Let me see if I can say this without overstating it. Besides certain forms of Islam, I think Hebrew Israelism is one of the most anti-Semitic religions that exists.
How's that for irony?
Yeah, but here's the funny thing they'll say. And you may have caught this if you paid attention to what Kanye said. Yay. They'll say, how can I be anti-Semitic if I'm Semitic?
Oh, right.
Yeah, they'll say something like that. And Kanye actually said that. He actually said that when they said, hey, this sounds like, you know, da-da-da. Well, I can't be anti-Semitic, which is a silly argument for a few reasons. One is people know what we mean by the term anti-Semitic, number one. And number two, you can be self-loathing or self-hating anyway. That's silly. Not only that, but the guys who believe in the 12 tribes chart also have something that they hold to that's the 18 nations. And they believe each modern day people group can be assigned an ancient biblical nation. So white people are Edomites. Well, if they're Edomites, they're descended from Esau. And if they're descended from Esau, guess what? They'd be Semitic. And yet Hebrew Israelites hate Edomites, generally speaking, of the One West variety, right? Sure. Well, that means they are anti-Semitic. Because Edomites would be Semites. Now, I know what I said is a little confusing, but if you're tracking with me, I think you're understanding.
Yeah, no, So let's take a step back for a second, because like I said, I'm self-editing here because I see so many logical and biblical and theological problems with all of this. So let me ask you this question kind of at a top level. When I see this, and I'm assuming most, I don't know what you want to call mainstream Christians or whatever, would see something like this and instantly be confused and sense its wrongness. So what do you think is the appeal that causes is there a scriptural support behind it? Is there a celebrity cult of celebrity behind it? What's causing it to be accepted as legitimate and not dismissed as fiction?
They would say the big chapter is Deuteronomy 28.
Is this about the
So
ships and the?
yeah, but it's the whole curses section.
Okay.
They think it describes
Oh,
the condition of Black America.
okay. Right.
And
So you got
so
28. The first half of that chapter is the blessings. Does that not describe? What does that describe?
question, who do you think used the blessing section as evidence they were Israelites? We discussed them earlier in the show.
I don't know. I'm trying to think of who would.
The Anglo Israelites.
Oh,
They used the
okay,
blessing
sure.
section to prove that Britain and her empire
Oh my goodness,
were
yeah.
the Israelites.
So
So
now we
these
have the
guys
other
used
side of the coin. Okay.
they were like, you know what? Let's use their other part of Deuteronomy 28. And so they go to the curses and they say, hey, this describes us. It doesn't describe those so-called rich Jews who control the world's banking system and the media, who are in Israel with all this stuff. It doesn't describe them. They're blessed. How could they be fulfilling the curses? It describes only us. You see, so they believe that the curses are the way you determine who's an Israelite, ultimately.
Okay. So
Yeah.
yeah, so it reminds me a little bit of Dan Brown's historical fiction, in that they take components, they take actual scripture, and they put it into a completely fictional narrative and somehow try to make it all tie together, which is a little bit frustrating. No, it's very much frustrating for me on a theological perspective. But what I've seen, and I've come to this understanding as well on the Torahism side, the Hebrew root side, which is a lot of the same theology minus the sort of historical genetic fallacy. But is there
Right.
There's a sense of, okay, this is as wacky and tinfoil hat as I might think this is. There are real lives that hang in the balance because they're believing this stuff. And so I'm
Yeah.
wondering what you getting out on the street and talking to people face to face who are maybe withdrawn from, or are they withdrawn from the academic logical arguments being made to promote this theology? What is like the man on the street, if there is some sort of a summary? Why are they in it, and what are they getting out of it?
Well, there's a few things there. One is everybody wants to know who they are, where they came from, where they're going, type of thing.
Yep.
It can be more acute. It can be more acute depending on your socioeconomic context. And so Hebrew Israelites use that to their advantage. So they will not only have a lot of times out on the street, if they're one Westers, the 12 tribes chart, but they'll also have pictures of the horrors of slavery and lynching. And they'll say, this shows we fulfill the curses. Your people did that to our people, they'll say sometimes to passersby. And so there's an emotional element that it's like, hey, I'm not what these oppressors said about me. I'm actually basically part of the central character of the story of the Bible. Not only that, but it's not love your neighbor in John 3:16 the way that the church has taught me, because that's just a sham. It's actually, we're going to put these other nations in slavery. And now this is one Westism. Not all Hebrew Israelites believe this version. This is one Westism. The
Okay.
other ones may have a softer version. They may say, no, Gentiles can be included. They just have to know their proper place, because there's a protocol and an order to the Most High. And so some Hebrew Israelites, if they watch this, will say VOCAB'S lying, because I'm not. So some things are specific to one West here,
Yeah.
but it gives a person who's not endowed with the gospel, which entails forgiveness and all kinds of other virtues, it gives them a sense of comeuppance and revenge. And so there's actually an appeal to that. And so you'll
Okay.
see comments that are like, I can't wait till we put him in chains. I can't, you'll get that kind of stuff from the more hard-edged guys. So it's ultimately an appeal to the flesh, because it's, hey, it's like the idolatry of ethnicity, perceived
Yeah,
ethnicity.
that breaks my
opposed to-
heart. Because
Yeah.
not only does it give a rise to the flesh, but it also denies the beautiful ethnicity God gave them at birth, as if that's of less value.
Yeah, sometimes when I'm debating one of these guys, Rob, they'll say, so you're telling me I'm just an African? It's like, there's a devouing of what it would mean that if you could be described as Semitic. There's a devaluing of it because the one Westers believe they're going to put Hamites in chains too, because the Hamites sold the Semites into slavery. It's the way they look at it.
Okay.
And so there's an anti-African strand within elements of Hebrew Israelism. Now, other forms of Hebrew Israelism are a lot more African-centered. And some would even go so far that basically have the whole continent be Israel, and as far as the people groups. And there's even versions, Rob, of Hebrew Israelism that believe Israel, the actual geographical location, is actually in Africa. They believe there's not just been an identity theft, but a geographical switcheroo. And Ron Dalton Jr. apparently is one of the people who believe that. Now, why do I bring him up? Ron Dalton Jr. is the creator of the movie that Kyrie Irving retweeted, Hebrews to Negroes, that Dave Chapelle was talking about on SNL. Okay. He was talking about this very movie. Ron Dalton has moved to South Africa, and apparently he believes he's in actual Israel now. So there's... Okay. Yeah. Now, one Westers don't believe that. The one Westers I've been talking about, the hard edge guys, because they're more anti-African in their stance a lot of times. Whereas some of the other non-one Westers, still Hebrew Israelites, they would think that's happened. I actually debated a guy on the location of Israel. It's on my channel, and he tries to make claims that actually Israel's somewhere on the continent of Africa. And people can laugh and all that, but look, people may have laughed at Mormonism, and yet it grew to this massive thing and has become a big part of American life, and is global. And, same thing with the Nation of Islam, and same thing with Muhammad and his prophethood. Whatever you name, we can, but next thing you know, oh, wait, we better take this serious. Yeah. And so I point people to my last live stream. There was a teacher who attended Biola, has a master's degree in education, was at a Northern California school in Hayward, and started teaching Hebrew Israelism, and even, according to the students' testimony, how Hitler salutes, and passed out a book called The Hidden Tyranny by Benjamin Friedman, which is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory document, and told them to read it. And he just now got put on paid leave just recently. It's been going on for years, apparently, with this teacher. Wow. And what about this teacher? When you study this teacher, who, again, I said, went to Biola, this teacher was at a church and embraced Hebrew Israelism and staged a coup to kick out the pastor who had been teaching there for 23 years, and now renamed the congregation, and now is in the news because of what he's doing there. Just look up the story, or just look up my last live stream. So this is real stuff affecting real lives, Yeah.
So your YouTube channel is at Vocab Malone, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, you guys check it out. There's amazing stuff there. So that's shocking when you hear that. I mean, the same thing is, the parallels between Torahism and what you're dealing with are so similar that you suddenly have, there's actually a summer camp for kids of Hebrew roots, what they call congregations, and all this stuff, and big communities coming up. And anyway, so a couple questions on the theological side, because what I want to do is start steering into how we, as mainstream Christians who believe, I don't even know how to describe
Who
it.
believe the gospel.
Yes, the gospel, exactly.
This version. Not this version. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. How do we I want to shift our conversation into how we combat that, or how do we engage with it? And specifically, I want to hear a little bit about how you do that. But one of my questions, since you've brought it up a couple of times, is I wanted to talk a little bit about the celebrity endorsement of this type of theology. I noticed your book was called Barack Obama versus the Black Hebrew Israelites. You mentioned Kanye and several others. What are you seeing in that sphere of celebrity endorsements?
Well, there's a lot more people who are known than people would realize who in some way have backed this thing. So much so that the creators of even South Park have taken notice. So if you look at South Park, which I don't recommend doing, but season 26, episode 1 that just came out a couple weeks ago, the main plot line had to do with Hebrew Israelism, and it was a Valentine's Day special. So Cupid, it was like Cupid Kanye. And so he's embracing Hebrew Israelism and spreading it to the students. It's a long story, and has a love affair, not literally love affair, but a love affair with the idea of Hitler, which if you caught Kanye's comments. Hitler wasn't such a bad guy, he was saying, and we need to give the Nazis another chance and stop talking bad about them. And I don't know if you saw these interviews, especially the ones with Alex Jones. Alex Jones was speechless because Alex Jones wasn't even riding with what Ye was saying.
Right.
That's how bad it was. And so South Park did a whole episode recently on this, and it's like, whoa. And so there's Ye, who still would call himself a Christian, but is embracing elements of Hebrew Israelism and even has appeared on some of their shows on Clubhouse. A lot of people don't know about that in the mainstream media because it wasn't NBC, ABC, but he was on with ISUPK's Captain Tazariak, a man I've debated, who told me that in the future of Vocab, you won't even be able to go get water without permission. He told me this in the context of a debate. These are the way these debates go, right? And it said, in Vocab...
Oh, go ahead.
Kanye was with this guy, did an interview with him. So I'm just saying that's how far it's reached. What are you saying, though, brother?
Well, the first thing I think of when you mention a lot of these types of things do they view themselves, or are they even trying to be Christ-like in their expression of their theology?
When I told Tazariak in that debate he wasn't being very Christ-like, they laughed at me because they took it as a way I was saying you're not being very Christian. And so they take Christian as a European effeminate sham of what the Bible teaches. So to them, that's a joke anyway.
Okay. Is that One West, or is that...
That's One West. ISUPK is actually probably the proudest promoter. They actually literally sell shirts that say One West on it, like a logo. Other groups like the Israel of God, who are much kinder, much nicer, much gentler, still Torahists though.
Right.
They would not embrace that kind of talk. They invited me to their to some of their functions and even ate with them. Gave me a car ride once in South Chicago. Invited me to some of their Bible studies, allowed me to speak my piece, even though we did disagree and stuff. They would say, well, we're actually the original Christians. We're like the real Christians. And so they would refer to us as Sunday Christians, but it's a slur. It's a way to say an ignorant, know nothing, sheeple, basically. That's what they mean by the Sunday Christian there. But they would be a lot nicer about it and say, we are Christians. We're just the original Christians.
Right. Okay. Well, so is there when you're meeting with them, when you're interacting with them, is there a sense of common ground that you can appeal to in terms of the Bible or theology?
That's tough. It's tough because we're both opening up the Bible, but then let's say we get to a certain point in the debate. I'll go back to the Israel of God discussion. At a certain point in the debate, one of the guys said, which I knew was coming at some point, well, you're not even an Israelite. This book wasn't even given to you to understand, and you really have no business teaching it, especially not to us, the people of the book. And I flexed a little bit there, and I was like, do any of you know the Greek alphabet? I'm the only one who's taken any kind of intro Greek, and you're telling me I'm not allowed to even open this up? That's bizarre to me, but let's just go there for a second. You don't think Luke was a Gentile? You don't think that Titus was a Gentile? Because I'm pretty sure they were. They had never heard that before, so we got into those arguments for those discussions. Because it's like, you can't use that argument. And eventually they kind of gave on Titus, but then they're like, yeah, but that was under Paul's authority, and those congregations he was over must have been all Gentile. So now this is the
apostle of the Gentile. Yeah, Gentiles.
And they'll say that. And they'll say, that's why you guys turn there, but you got to understand he's still one of us. Now, some of the other groups, so that's Israel of God, nice guys. Disagree, obviously.
Yep.
Other guys like Sakari, they actually will throw
Is
Paul. Is
Sakari a group or a person? I'm sorry.
Sakari is a group, becoming very prominent, and they're named after Jewish assassins in the first century, if you know about the Sakari, ladies and gentlemen. And they will, when it's convenient to them, throw Paul under the bus. So they'll say Paul got corrected here, Paul was wrong here, Paul went off here, that kind of thing. And so you have people who are willing to do that. And another guy leads a group. He'll say, well, Paul's letters are rabbinical opinion for Gentiles, but I'm not a Gentile under his rabbi-ship, so they're not relevant to me, so don't quote them. Okay. So they a lot of these groups will find ways to get out of under the pen of Paul. They think
Right.
that's where Christians always run to. Oh, look, he's running to Paul. And then they go to Peter to say, oh, look, it says that these things are hard to understand, so don't run there. That's like their proof text to say, don't touch it. We'll handle this type of thing.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. It's the same thing I run into all the time too.
Yeah.
Even
So
though
I
it
imagine
doesn't
there's
say
some
which
similar.
things are. So, okay. So there's so many
Yeah.
things spinning through my head right now. So without a lack of common ground, it becomes very difficult, I would think, to have a fruitful discussion. If it's almost like saying, well, you have your rules about how math works and I have my rules, so let me show you why you should come up with this final, sum in this arithmetic or something.
Actually, they go to Isaiah and they say precept upon precept. The problem with you, Vocab, is you read the Bible like a novel in chronological order, but it's precept upon precept, which basically they mean by that proof text stacking.
Right. But again, there's no to untangle that idea of what precept on precept means out of Isaiah's pen at that time to his audience. To untangle all that must be tremendously difficult. Is it even possible to come to terms on some of these things?
Well, guys and gals come out of this, and they often do cite a debate or an interaction as being instrumental in their leaving the fold, so
Okay.
to speak. And
So there's a crack in their theology or something that the Lord uses to kind of wake them up.
James White debated Elder Rakah of the GOCC, and it was such a one-sided event that a lot of people left GOCC, and I still talk to them today. The leader of the Australian camp in GOCC left, and now him and I are friends. And coming up here next month, Rob, the leader of Sakari is debating Dr. Michael Brown.
Okay.
And this is one of the times where I will pat myself on the back. I set both of those debates up.
Nice. That would be an interesting debate.
It will be an interesting debate, and I'm looking forward to it. And
I have we'll have to pray for Dr. Brown because again, that the problem with the lack of common ground that's agreed upon becomes very problematic, because those who are like you and I, who feel that we are under the authority of Scripture and we need to not read things into it, we need to take it at what it says. That is our parameters for understanding and building the theology that we built. It's scripturally based. It's Christ-centered. When you have other folks who don't mind throwing in things, it's almost like a kid can draw any kind of monster they want, and you can't tell them it's wrong because it's their monster, right? So, how you come to a meeting of the minds on that, it's going to be a tall order. Although Dr. Brown's pretty brilliant, so
yeah, they also. Most of the One Westers and a lot of the other guys, they also get down, as in they also co-sign the Apocrypha. So they throw that into their canon as well. Okay. So I'm like, so you kick out Paul and add the Apocrypha. Now, if they're Tanakh-only Hebrew Israelites, which do exist, they're just usually not the street corner guys. The Tanakh-only guys usually set up their own schools and are a little more quiet. And now, not all of them, but they usually don't tend to be out on the street. They, of course, view that as all just Christian nonsense. And a lot of the Tanakh-only Hebrew Israelites embrace some of the silliness, frankly, of what's called the conscious community, which I talk a little bit about Street Level Apologetics. It's a larger thing. And one of the key ideas of the conscious community is Jesus Christ never existed. So Tanakh-only Hebrew Israelites usually don't even believe Jesus existed.
Okay.
Now that's a whole nother field,
right.
But I just want people to know that those guys exist too. Arguing with them is much more like debating a Jewish person who holds to the Old Covenant. But I've noticed something about a lot of the Old Testament only Hebrew Israelites. A lot of them also are into the mysticism element. So you get lots of talk about gematria and the vibrations of sounds, and get into the Zohar and things like that. So it's a whole other ball game, ladies and gentlemen. One of the most prominent guys in that is a guy named Zion Lex, who definitely is an intelligent guy. I don't take that away from him, but he's definitely off.
Okay. Wow. All right. So, dang. Okay. I have to throw out a bunch of other questions because I want to be respectful of your time, and I really do want to kind of get into the engaging of it. So, let me just kind of throw out a broad question about. I think you and I and most folks watching this probably understand the theological error that's happening, not understand necessarily why, but that it's off. But they're also, like you've alluded to and other folks have said, bad theology leads to bad life choices or decisions or, bad morality. And there's all kinds of outworkings of having the wrong theology. And so
Polygamy.
I'm curious, what do you see in this sphere in terms of the damages that people suffer? What are their risks? Is there even to put it in this way, if someone genuinely professed faith in Jesus but held a lot of this other junk at the same time, is there salvation at stake? Is this a false gospel? Where do you land on that?
Every version of the gospel so far that I've encountered by Hebrew Israelite is a false gospel. Now, there are Christians who embrace elements of Hebrew Israelism, but I don't necessarily think it'd be proper to necessarily put them in the box of Hebrew Israelite, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Because you could embrace some bad ideas, but not be all the way in. But most versions you look at and you're like, well, this is a works-based salvation. For example, I held up this book earlier. This is the gospel, raw, uncut, and
who's
unheard.
The author?
This is Josiah Israel. Here, okay. I go to right here, this little section. I just want to show you, I'm just going to read this little preface here to this chapter. The tree of life. In the beginning of the creation of mankind, this tree stood in the midst of a garden paradise called Eden. This tree contained all the ingredients of eternal life. Ever since the first man, Adam, and his wife Eve, the mother of all living, sinned against the Elohim, access to this tree have been denied to man. Yahweh has showed us through his word how we shall be able to access the tree of life again, whose leaves shall be for the healing of the nations. Question: would you like to gain access to this tree? Here's what Yah's word says. And then it's basically a bunch of stuff that says, keep the law, keep the law, keep the law, keep the law. So that's an example. That's an example. And then another example is what I actually call salvation by race. And one-Westers believe in salvation by race because a lot of times Christian apologists deal with these guys. And when they deal with the one-Westers, it sounds like works-based salvation, but they don't fully understand the One West message. The One West message is if you're an Israelite, no matter what you do, you're going to inherit the kingdom. Keeping the law is proof that you're one of the elect of Israel, one of the 1/3, not one of the 2/3. But all Israelites are going to inherit the kingdom and rule over the other nations. So one time, one of these guys said, so you believe a murderer can commit murders and then repent and ask Jesus and then he'll be okay? And I'll say yes. And you believe that Judas Iscariot is going to be in the kingdom with sex slaves and slaves, don't you? Just simply because he's an Israelite. Well, yeah. Okay. Well, so that's salvation by race, basically. If you're deemed to be an Israelite, so it's an ethnic universalism. Yeah. Now that's within one Westism only. Okay. Some of the other groups do not hold to that. They think that there's righteous Gentiles who will get in and things like that as well. But the one Westers, the guys with the chart, it's a salvation by race, one West universalism. So keeping the law is actually ultimately doesn't do anything for you except ensure you're one of the elect. And what's that mean? It means you escape the thermonuclear fire that's going to befall upon America. That's all it means. You won't have to eat a missile in their vernacular.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you're engaging with them and you hear some of these things you're talking about, which in your mind, I know you've done a lot of work and thought it through and you're understanding that, hey, this is, whatever it is, ethnic universalism, you've got a category for that in your brain. But if someone's just chatting with somebody or when you're walking up to a stranger on the street and you each don't know what each other believes yet, and you hear some of this stuff, do you have go-to verses that you'll bring up to kind of get them to question their position? Do you have arguments? Like what would be a good way to address what you just said about being, hey, if you're Israel, you're saved automatically? How might you go about addressing that?
Well, all who are Israel, not Israel. So I will go to Romans. I would go to discussion of Romans 9 through 11, for example.
Yeah.
They try to find ways around those passages. The one Westers who believe in the ethnic universalism, none of the explanations are good. And usually they're going to take you somewhere else. Usually they're going to take you somewhere else. They do not have steady answers to Romans 9 through 11. Usually what a more sophisticated Israelite will try to do is try to take you to some of the Old Testament background passages that are utilized in Romans and force a definitive meaning there, and then go back to Romans and say, so Romans can't mean what that is saying there, what you're saying.
Right.
So even though Paul was clearly using it, perhaps sometimes some of these passages, and maybe what we would call surprising ways, perhaps, they will sort of limit what could be meant by there a lot of times. That's the more sophisticated. Others just simply just leave to go to something else. They'll say something like, only Israel have I known. So it can't be anyone. It's only Israelites. Something like that.
So is it just a matter of just like throwing scriptures out sometimes on their part, like a kind of overwhelming?
Yes. And so let's say you're in a street scenario. A lot of times they'll have a PA and it's multiple guys, and you'll be like, well, let me say, and they'll tell the guy, hey, read Amos 8 or whatever it is. And the guy will start reading. And if you say something, don't read while the Bible's being spoken. So this is in a more aggressive situation I'm speaking of here in a street encounter. Let's say it's a guy or a gal at your job and you're on lunch break. That's different. And I would almost encourage people, act like you never heard this interview and just ask them questions to find out what they believe. Because some of the stuff I said, they may not believe. And you're really just going to have to find out. It's very idiosyncratic. It's very specific to the person. And that's where Colossians 4, 5, 6 comes into play. Know how you ought to answer each person, each individual, that your conversation may be seasoned with salt and grace. And so there's an element of, specific to that person. So you just got to really listen and hear them out. Don't tell them what they believe because you don't know. Now, there's an advantage to knowing what some of the specific groups believe, because if they're a specific group, then you have some idea, this group believes that. So there's that. So it depends on the context there. If it's at a work situation, you're going to have to do a lot of listening. And to be honest, you're going to have to swallow your pride because a lot of Hebrew Israelites are a little patronizing towards Christians, and you just got to get over that. And you're going to have to get over what people these days call microaggressions, because they're going to have micro and macroaggressions. If you're deemed not on their chart, you're just going to have to just go ahead. You're going to be okay. You're in Christ. And so just do that. And then you say, okay, now it's time to ask a question. If you're on the street and the Lord compels you to interact, I would say the best way is to take the offense and attack, say, for example, the 12 tribes chart is fallacious or something they're saying, or bring a verse that contradicts what they're saying. For example, Galatians 3 twice says, if you're in Christ, it says it in different ways each time, then you're of Abraham.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
It's like, so sometimes I'll say, what's more important? What's more important, to be in Christ or to be in Abraham? If you can't answer that, you've got a problem. And they usually go, both. Abraham first, because that's the only way you can qualify to be in Christ. Things like that. No. Let's read Galatians 3. Yeah. So it really depends on the context and scenario. If you're out in the street, it's one thing. If you're at work, it's another. So I try to tell people, like, really got to be very contextual with this, because you just don't know what's going on in the context, and just be wise and say, what's this situation versus that situation? And they are different. I don't deal with a guy when I'm having pizza with him the same way that I deal with a guy on the microphone who's embarrassing people walking by. I don't deal with them the same way, Sure. The questions may even be similar or the same, Rob, but the way I'm going to do it, it's contextualized, And so it depends. Yeah. But here's what I would say. Don't have fear. Christians, we got to do this, because if you go to a church and you're watching this and you go to a primary black or brown church, they're going to show up at your door pretty soon, or email your pastor. How do I know? I've seen it, and my friends show me. And they do a thing called the church blitz. And the church blitz is where they show up in your parking lot and they yell when you come out and say, we just want to talk to the pastor. And their whole goal is to make a video embarrassing him. So they're after us, folks. They're after us. So I would encourage you to talk. It may take a while. There's a big learning curve with this stuff. Big learning curve.
Sounds like it, yeah. So is there, when you go out, let's say you're going to engage with some folks on the street intentionally, are you bringing a scripture with you? And do they have versions of the Bible that are different, or will they accept popular translations?
A lot of these guys are King James Version only. A lot of them are, but more and more as it diversifies, they're not all King James Version only. You know, I'm talking about the guys who embrace the New Testament here, and they will supply different words sometimes when they see fit. So if they're a one-Wester And when they get to the term for God that would usually be Yahweh, or Lord that would usually be Yahweh, they'll say Yahweh. That's how you know you're dealing with, if you hear Yahweh, you know you're dealing with a One Wester or a One West influenced person. When it comes to Jesus, if they say instead of Jesus, they say Yahweh Shai. Yahweh Shai is a One West term for Jesus. It's basically Joshua and their Lashawan Quadash. So that will let you know.
Oh,
now, if
I was wondering where that came from, because I'm like, that's not even correct in Hebrew. Where did that come from?
It's Joshua, and they take out most of the syllable sounds and replace them, almost all of them, with ah. Okay. That's essentially what's going on there, with some exceptions, as you can hear Yahweh Shai. But so
if you have a Bible, you can at least, while you're talking to them, and you said, hey, let's see what Galatians 3 says about being the seed of Abraham. They wouldn't necessarily reject. They might try to retranslate it, but they'd be okay with the translation you bring to the table.
Sometimes. So like, let's say we go to, Deuteronomy 23:7. Deuteronomy 23:7 says, do not abhor an Edomite. And it also says you got to accept an Egyptian, but I'm going to bracket that for a second. It's instructions for Israel regarding Edomites to be able to enter into the congregation of Yahweh. The congregation of Yahweh, it doesn't just mean hanging out with Israel, because these particular Edomites would already be doing that. These are people who are going to be allowed, after their third or fourth generation of having children living amongst them, if they're faithful, they can enter essentially into full covenantal life. That's what the abhor means. It really has to do primarily with, in the sense of covenant participation. Now, why do I bring that up? One Westers, as I told you before, believe Edomites are white people. White people are Edomites because they're red, according to Genesis 25. And so they're doomed. They can't have repentance, according to Hebrews, in this interpretation, because Esau sought it with tears but wasn't granted it. Okay. So I go there and I'll show them Deuteronomy 23:7. And a common response is, that's a clerical error. Clerical error. And it comes out of a misreading of a Strong's entry. So I have a video, and the thumbnail actually has a guy saying it's a clerical error, because it's a common response for Deuteronomy 20. So that a lot of times shuts down the argument, but they're wrong. It's not a clerical error. It is an Edomite in that passage. And it even gives the reason. It says, because he is your brother. That only makes sense if it's an Edomite. Deuteronomy 23:7 makes sense because Jacob and Esau. It makes sense to say the Edomite is your brother.
Right.
Okay. Because just in the passage, Rob, you know this, the rationale for the Egyptian is you were also a foreigner living in his land. So the rationale directly relates to the person involved, the Edomite and the Egyptian. And so my point by saying that is I'm saying yes, but with qualifications. Okay. They will, they'll get away from that one, for example. There's another response, but we're not going to get into that. So it depends. But a lot of these guys, they teach that King James actually was a Black Israelite too. Yeah. Okay,
well, that brings up my next thought. Now, just as an apologist myself, my wheels have been spinning while we've been talking. And one way that I would think that I might approach this, and I'm trying to think of in terms of folks who haven't maybe studied as much about history and they don't know who the Edomites are, or, they may not be as biblically literate. I don't even know if that's a good word, but you know what I mean? As far as history.
Yeah.
What would you think about? Oh, all right.
Sorry, I'm just showing you some of their books that they like to use, but go ahead.
So the thought I had was something that it's actually a technique. Have you heard of the 5 whys? It was kind of invented by, I think, the Toyota company when they were troubleshooting problems with a car. Car won't start. Why won't the car start? You asked the second question. Well, because the alternator's not turning over. Why is it not turning over? Because the battery's dead. Why is you get the idea. The 5 whys drill down. I'm wondering if that might be an interesting technique, because what you're doing is putting the onus on the other person. Maybe I'm grabbing a little bit from Greg Kokel's book Tactics here, but to say, oh, really? We're the tribe of whatever is part of this country. Why? How did you come to that conclusion? Where did you find that? I mean, so you're drilling down, because it seems to me, if I'm correct, that everything that they are asserting is without basis, without truthful basis in terms of history or scripture or theology. So I don't know if you would be able to get someone to at least question. Eventually they're going to say, I believe it because somebody told it to me. Right.
Yeah, but it's more sophisticated than that. And by the way, I agree with you. In my little book here, I have a chapter called Questioning Apologetics. And the whole chapter is about how to do some of what you said. Now, I don't have the 5 whys from Toyota, but I quote Coco a lot in there. The Hebrew Israelites generally view Christians as stupid ignoramuses who know nothing except some passages on tithing in John 3:16. They view themselves as sort of masters of the scripture who can destroy any given Christian on any given day. This is kind of how they view things. And so because of that, they will bring forth what they think is a reasonable answer. And if it doesn't work for an answer, they can use group dynamics to shut you down as well. If we're out in a street situation or even in a one-on-one, honestly, you'll be alone with some of these guys and no one is watching and they'll be doing kind of theatrics as if there's a camera on. And I'm like, bro, it's just you and me. Why are you acting this way? We're just trying to have a normal conversation. You don't have to show out for anybody. What is this? So sometimes you do get that. And I view that as essentially it's because they know the argument is weak. But so let's say someone said, well, why is such and such part of the tribe? Like, let's say they said, why do you call Mexicans Issachar on your 12 tribes chart? They're actually going to go to Genesis 49. Now, what's the problem? Most Christians don't know what's in Genesis 49. They don't know about Genesis 49. And they'll turn there and they'll start reading it and they'll give their interpretation, which will say things like he entered the land, saw it was beautiful, and that the rest was good or something like that, depending on your translation. They'll actually say Mexico is a beautiful land and they take siestas, and this is evidence of it because it says rest. He took their rest.
How did you come to that conclusion that was about Mexico and not other places that take rests? I'm just doing my own example.
Right. Well, so I've brought that to them and I said, it looks like the Spaniards are the ones who invented the siesta from what I can tell. It's a European custom imported onto the land. And I've never got a good answer. So they essentially, that's where the avoidance comes in. But most Christians, they don't know what's happening in Genesis 49. They don't know. So they're just going there and it's like flailing about. So they'll read this thing and give their interpretation. And then a lot of times we'll go to the next place. So it'll appear they are giving an answer. And and that's why I call it Hebrew hopscotch. But I'm telling you, a lot of people find it convincing because these guys have so much confidence and a certain amount of speed.
Sure.
A lot of times, not just the audience, but a lot of Christians convert because they're like, well, he showed me I didn't know anything about the Bible. And so they convert. So in an interview, when I'm breaking it down and there's no theatrics involved, it sounds unbelievable. But in a real life situation where people feel pressure on them and stuff, it can be way more compelling than a person realizes and is ready for. It can be kind of tricky. So I just encourage people to be ready because one common trick they do is go to really obscure Old Testament passages that Christians don't know generally. So it's difficult to give an answer or response. So Jeremiah 14:2. Judah is blackened to the ground in the KJV. Well, what it means is Judah's mourning down. And it's even in the Hebrew, when you look, the verbiage is right there. And even saying blackened to the ground, it's an old way to say mourning, basically. Yeah. Well, they'll use it as evidence for Judah's color, a lot of these guys. But if you just go to Jeremiah 14:2 and they'll say, what color was Judah? Well, I don't know. I guess they were brown. No, they were black. Let me prove it to you. Read Jeremiah 14:2. Judah was blackened to the ground. So you can see right there. So you see what I'm saying? Yep. That's kind of how it'll go. And so it can be tricky. But
there's that social dynamic too. Like you said, it can be sort of dizzying to hear that. Yeah. So what are you doing in terms of the work that you're doing in your ministry? Are you putting out, I know, I kind of know the answer, but I want you to talk about it so we can all learn about it. The types of material that you're putting out to help folks deal with these kinds of theologies.
Well, I got 2 books, one specifically on Hebrew Israelites. It has a strange title, but that's so you'll remember it, Barack Obama versus the Black Hebrew Israelites. And another one, Street Apologetics, which includes more like techniques and stuff like that. And it's not really just about Hebrew Israelites. It's really about evangelism and apologetics and stuff like that. But then I do regular live streaming and on other social media platforms. I do short form videos as well, usually where I'll make a brief comment, then play a clip of a Hebrew Israelite, then make a brief comment afterwards. So it's more about education. Like, here's what these guys teach. So I'm trying to take away the shock factor for Christians. So a big element of when you first deal with these guys is the shock factor. You're like, You believe that. But if that's removed, then we get into the denial or disbelief stage to answering stage. So a lot of what I try to do is take away the shock factor. We're like, oh yeah, I've heard that. Okay, let me start to form an answer instead of just being like, what?
Right.
Because that's a common response, is sort of just aghast. And so I do that on YouTube and other social media, as I mentioned, working on new books. And I do have a little blog I run called The Shield. It's at theshieldSquad.com, theshieldSquad.com. The idea of shield is protect and defense there. And there I write about these obscure topics. My last article was about the Hebraic Indian theory, which shows up in Mormonism, even in early Puritans and some Catholics, and of course now in the Hebrew Israelites 12 tribes chart. And I have other articles about those types of things. And then I do go to churches and stuff and try to do some education and stuff, and do a decent amount of debates. And I do go out on the street and film it. I don't do that every single week, but I do that. And the idea is, hey, Christians, you don't have to be afraid. And here's what this could look like, to engage perhaps. And so a number of things. And that's why I usually don't get enough sleep.
No kidding. Yeah. So what's interesting about you and I is that we both have, I think, very, very similar theology, but we both exercise it in sort of different spheres and in different ways. The street apologist is not something that I do, and I have mad respect for you for doing that. I think that's amazing. But I think we probably both have grappled with, I'm guessing, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the idea that what we're seeking is unity in the body of Christ, but there are times when we also need to confront false teachings. And this is something that we see modeled in Christ, who he levied the woes against the Pharisees at the same time as loving people and trying to hold those in balance. So I'm curious what your theory is in terms of confrontation versus sort of reconciliation or cleaning it up, or building bridges kind of thing. Where do you come down on that? I'm not sure have you thought much about that side of things?
Yes. I was probably pretty naive in a lot of ways when I first got into this. And I was probably less pessimistic about some of the hope for that. And as I went along, I saw there was a lot more of a sort of insidious nature to a lot of Hebrew Israelism, and to where it really was not gospel-centered in any meaningful way. And when I say it, I mean really any permutation, almost any version of it that I encountered. Even when they would say, no, we're New Testament Christians, you come to find out this is not a gospel-centered, Christocentric religion. Almost all of it is non-Trinitarian. A lot of it is anti-Trinitarian. And even if it's not outright exclusivist in the sense of you're of the wrong color or ethnicity, therefore you can't be in God's club, it would still stratify people according to ethnicity. So I call it an ethnic hierarchy. And a lot of the groups have actually embraced it. They're like, yeah, there's an ethnic hierarchy within the kingdom. That was my term to describe the fact that not all were out and out bigot, but they would still have these layers of strata in which Israelites are at the top, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I do not believe this is something we should compromise with in our churches or in any meaningful way to do anything with, because it's way more insidious than people realize. And I look at the way Paul dealt with the Judaizers, and I see cut off language and I see anathema language. And so I do not see us as being able to hold hands in a meaningful sense as far as ecumenically speaking. Yeah. Now, that's different than how I will treat someone and respect them and view them. I love to stand side by side with the Hebrew Israelite and have a calm, ordered dialogue. That's my favorite kind. I love to be able to text a guy back and forth in an honest way and say, let's talk about this in a calm, peaceful manner. I like having email exchanges where we're actually interacting with the other arguments. Now, these are way more rare than I would like, Rob. I love when I'm able to go out and have lunch with a guy. And again, these are all much more rare. I'm not acting like these are much more infrequent than they should be. And I always try to give the open hand. When I was dealing with Islam as a primary thing, I primarily dealt with conservative Muslims, Salafi. And this is going to sound weird. As a general rule, they were much more open to this kind of dialogue and talk than a lot of the Hebrew Israelites. And I think that's because probably the identity piece is much more tied in with this sort of ethnic based Israelism than it is with, say, Islam, even though I understand that identity is still part and parcel. But I think that's probably why. So it's much more like guarded, because you can't take that away. You can't take that away. It's my
Right.
treasure, And so I do not. I think Christians need to be much more aware, because a lot of times when they're on the outside looking in, Rob, they'll say, Vocab, the way you deal with this sometimes, and I say, I hear you on that, and I want you to be able to deal with it your own way. But a lot of times, some of the criticism comes from simply ignorance. They don't realize the nature of the problem, or they don't really understand what their theological opponents believe. So they think it's less harmful than it is. They don't
Right.
realize how racist it is. They don't realize how anti-gospel, anti-Trinitarian. They don't realize a lot of those things. They don't realize that it would destroy any kind of hope for unity in the body of Christ. So sometimes they are not aware, and that's what I mean by I was naive a little bit as well.
Yeah.
And so I sometimes wish Christians would say, okay, I hear you on that. I'm still going to do this way, but I'm a lot more aware, and I'll be a lot more cautious, But a lot of times they end up having to kind of learn on their own. And then a lot of times when these Christians do, when they see kind of how it is, they usually give up. I don't have time to deal with that. I don't know why you waste your time. That's what
Right.
it turns into.
It's
A lot of
tempting,
times. Yeah, a lot of times it turns into that versus you're doing it the wrong way to why are you even doing this at all? It's pointless. I think you.
Right. I know. Yeah. I've had the same internal struggle myself. But what I've come to, and I've been naive too, and maybe I still am to a degree. And maybe it's also that Torahism or Hebrew roots isn't quite so diametrically opposed. And there's the possibility that they could be a brother in Christ, but feel like they have to keep Sabbath. Whereas
Right, yeah.
when you're talking about ethnic strata and saying this person's lower than this, it's pretty clear cut. So I tend to be more kind about it. But at the same time, when we get into it and I have to call someone to the carpet or really be strong, and you have to do that a lot more than I do, what I think we're seeing is what love looks like in that situation as modeled by Christ. Again, with the woes to the Pharisees, he loved everyone and he loved them perfectly. And some people he called a brood of vipers. So we have to understand that love isn't this fuzzy feeling. Sometimes it takes men like yourself to actually look someone in the eyeballs and say, no, that's wrong, And so I applaud you for that. I think that's great. I do think we're in a little bit of a cultural time where two things are kind of conflating or clashing. One is the idea of be nice, fuzzy stuff, the microaggressions, and everyone has to be extra careful not to step on toes. And the other thing is, and we're in the middle of I don't know where we are, but we are in a racially powerful time in history. I mean, it's not that long ago, if we look back, that even if you want to look at the big picture, that slaves were set free in America, historically speaking. But even if you want to talk about the civil rights movement of the 60s, right, and this equality, we're still sort of reeling as a country and trying to find out where's the equilibrium, and the pendulum swings back and forth, and race becomes a very hot button issue. So to be able to step up and talk about that openly, that takes a lot more courage now than maybe it used to. You know what I mean? If you're trying to be culturally sensitive and biblically sound, that's kind of what I'm getting at. That becomes a difficult balancing act.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult, very tricky. It's interesting with the rise in awareness in the past, say, year of anti-Semitic sentiments from various quarters. I have had a number of religiously or secular but ethnically Jewish folks contact me, whether it's a reporter or something like that, even a few cases a rabbi. And it's interesting. They kind of don't know what to do with Christians who are in this sphere, because they're glad to kind of see an ally on one hand.
Right.
Obviously, if they're religiously Jewish, they're concerned about, well, yeah, but there's this Jesus stuff, and you kind of don't really know what you're talking about anyway either. But at least you're standing against anti-Semitism. But maybe you're a Christian, so maybe you're anti-Semitic yourself. I just don't know it yet. Right. And I'm just telling you the vibes I get sometimes. And then on the secular side, it's like, well, I'm glad you're standing against anti-Semitism as a Jew, but you're really conservative and maybe hateful because some of your views with this Bible thing are a little serious, And so it's very interesting to see. I'm not saying they express all this explicitly in the way I'm saying it, right, but you do get that. So it's a very interesting moment because people were wondering, like, what do we do with this Hebrew Israelite stuff? But it's a tricky cultural moment
Right.
for people, because they're concerned about, they don't want to appear going against people, and it's a lot of landmines, a lot of pitfalls potentially, no doubt about that. And
Yeah, and you don't fit nicely into
yeah,
categories, the work that you're doing and the people that you're talking to. So I'm sure that's a little bit
yeah.
throws people for a loop for a bit.
Yeah, that's true. And the current tensions and stuff in our world and whatever, they
Yeah.
definitely contribute to the rise of people wanting to glom onto something like Israelism.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I know people literally who have said things like, I looked up after somebody was killed by the police. I looked up, like, why is this happening to our people? And the first videos they found were Hebrew Israelite videos, and became a Hebrew Israelite because they were trying to figure out some question relating to police brutality and injustice, and they ended up a Hebrew Israelite because they felt they
Wow.
had the answer. Well, our people aren't keeping the law, so they're cursed. So this kind of thing is happening. So keep the law, realize you're an Israelite, and we'll rule over the nations one day. That's the answer. Okay.
Oh, that's heartbreaking. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting. I had a debate with Rabbi Singer last summer here in Nashville, and as we were
Nice.
chatting beforehand, I mentioned to him about my second book, Divergence, which is about the split between Jews and Christians, the first 3 centuries of the Christian
Mhm.
faith. And I mentioned to him that 100% of I just realized this is going to be a humble brag, but if it's true, it's true.
That's
100%
okay.
of the
I
proceeds.
did a couple too.
Okay. But all the proceeds, I'm not making any money off that book. 100% are being donated to Stand With Us, which is an
Mhm.
anti-Semitism group that teaches, it's educationally around the world. And he said, really? Because I don't know if you know, Rabbi Singer has a lot to say about how anti-Semitic the New Testament is.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so he didn't have a category to put that in. He was grateful that a Christian would donate money and support a cause that fights
Yeah.
anti-Semitism. But yet at the same time, I think he had that thought like you, but the book you're promoting, or the New Testament, the book you're following, is
Right.
anti-Semitic. So yeah. So that's
And
great.
that's tough, because the passage that Hebrew Israelites always throw at ethnic Jews is Revelation 2:9, which I would, of course, say they're misinterpreting. But they'll throw Revelation 2:9, and Jewish people hear that and, like, well, that's from the New Testament.
Is that Synagogue of Satan?
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell you how much they throw that at
I'll
them.
bet. Yeah. That's
That's
ticking.
all they.
Yeah, that's used a lot in many, heinous ways.
Yep, they love the synagogue of Satan verses. Let me show you a couple of sort of. So here's a book. Let me just show you real quick here. Let me
Okay.
just give you a flavor of this. The Hebrew Israelite Manifesto. There's the book. Oh wait, let me come closer, not farther away.
Yeah, how do I get closer? I got to figure it out.
Well, it just make my screen the only one temporarily. But if you can't, that's okay. That works. So look at these memes in the book. This one is tracing America's enslavement to Jewish bankers. That's what that
Wow.
one says there. And then over here is weapons of mass deception. And at the top, it's got an unflattering caricature of a Jewish person, and then has the mass media. Here you've got Israel flag, cufflink, whatever sleeve with America, shaking hands over blood. Implication here, of course, is that the Jewish people supposedly ran the slave trade. Then you
Wow.
turn the page, and then you go a little bit farther, and you literally see, watch this. Who are the real Hebrews? Who are the fake Jews? An enemy did this. And then it has deception.
Oh my
There
goodness.
with it looks like a group of perhaps Ashkenazim there. And then you keep on going, and hi, I'm Evelyn Rothschild. My family financed the Nazis. And then it's this list of all the evil things that ostensibly Jewish people have done.
Oh my
And
goodness.
you go on, and chapter 6 here is mission of the fake Jews. And here's their mission with, Anton LaVey and everybody else. Instead of Hollywood, it says Holocaust. And you go on and on and on. And you're
That is,
getting the
you
idea.
weren't kidding. I mean, when you said that it's anti-Semitic, I mean, that is horrendous stuff right there.
Yeah. Jews, Jewish-owned corporations. I mean, this is just one book, right?
Wow.
Fruits. Okay, so you're getting the idea here, and the Jews are blamed for the pornography industry and The Talmud has satanic verses, and okay, you're getting the idea. But
Yeah.
scriptural evidence that Ashkenazi Jews are not Israel. So it's a whole chapter 8 is all about
What's the
that.
name of that book?
This particular one is the Hebrew Israelite Manifesto by Prophet Travis Refuge. That's an example. Here's the thing, though, with these books, a lot of the really influential Hebrew Israelites haven't written books. And so it's interesting. A lot of the Hebrew Israelite authors are lesser known because the most popular Hebrew Israelites are popular by video medium.
Sure.
But I have a couple interesting ones. Here's another interesting one, Hebrew Israelites for Dummies. but it's a pro Hebrew Israelite book. Identify the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Expose false doctrine in the Christian church.
Wow.
So you the idea here.
Yeah.
So I probably I don't know anyone who has more Hebrew Israelite books by Hebrew Israelites than me. Most Hebrew Israelites themselves don't buy Hebrew Israelite books, so it's kind of weird in my collection.
Well, that's awesome though. You're arming yourself.
Stuff.
Yeah, that's beautiful. You're arming yourself for the conversation. So, all right. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. Let's wrap it up. I'd love to have you on again. I need to do a little study and research. So as we wrap up, I just wanted to give our viewers an overview. Where can they find your books? Where can they find your videos? How can they get in touch with you if they want to chat?
Yeah, both of these are on Amazon.
Okay.
Both of these books are on Amazon and
Perfect.
And at other places too, like I forget the other websites, but you can find it if you poke around. And then, youtube.com/Vocab Malone. The blog is at theshieldSquad.com. And I have another website I'm working on that's really under construction, but it's called HebrewIsraeliteInfo.com. And there I have historically archived materials. Right now I have like 5 or 6 digital books up by some of the first Hebrew Israelite, some of the older Hebrew Israelite books from like the 1900s I have, where you can download the PDF because, they're not copyrighted or anything at this point. And so it's more historical research, but it's underdeveloped right now, but it has some things up there for research purposes.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. That's great. So, man, bless you for the work you're doing. I know it's not necessarily in the mainstream, but like you and I talked about before, once you're in it, you realize how big it is and how damaging it is to people. So the work you're doing is super important, and I'm grateful that you're on the team, so to speak.
Well, yeah, like I was joking before, you and I could probably write a book together, bam, boom. But I really like the stuff you're doing, and I do got to get you on my channel. I got to find out what your schedule is and try to get you over on my channel and do some cool stuff together.
That'd be great. Yeah. And by the way, you guys who don't know, Vocab does some funny stuff too. He uses humor and satire in some ways to get his point across, and it's pretty effective.
That's good to hear. Every now and then I do. Yeah. We try to have fun. We try to have fun over there, and I interact with people on the live chat when I can, and update people on news stories related to this as well. So that's not the only thing I do, but it is the main thing I do. So every now and then you'll see stuff on Mormons and some other stuff like that. But yeah, good stuff. I'd recommend it to my viewers to go check out what he's doing. Excellent stuff. So great. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time, Vocab. Thank you. It was great to be here and get to know you. And I love the work you're doing, and keep it up, because it's a underserved area. And I do get a lot of questions about this topic, and I always just recommend you, Same. That's funny. Yeah. I should get referral points or something, sending people your way. Me too. Yeah. Awesome, man. Well, it's great to connect. That's awesome. I appreciate it. And thank you very much. And thanks for watching, everyone. Shalom.